think Dutch bulbs are one of the best values that you can have in the garden. You buy these little nondescript looking, dried, funny looking things in the fall, and in the spring you just have beautiful color through the garden, and many of them will come back year after year. I want to give you a few tips on how to buy them. First of all, you can either buy bulbs mail order, although it's getting a little late for that, or you can go to a local garden center. And the nice thing about bulb purchases, if you go to a hardware store or a garden center, is they have worlds of information to give you to take home with you. They have little tear-off sheets for each variety that tell you how deep to plant them and so forth. A couple other tips is make sure when you're picking out bulbs that they're healthy, free of any spots, fungal spots, disease, what have you, and check the part where the roots come out. This is called the basal plate, and you want to make sure that that's nice and firm and free from disease. That's a very important part of the bulb because that's where your roots are going to emerge. Now around the top of the bulb, make sure that that's nice and firm. Sort of like when you're picking out onions in the grocery store. It's the same idea. You want nice, firm bulbs. Now October is the ideal time to plant bulbs in Oklahoma. If you're just planting tulips, however, you can go through the month of November in planting those. Now, if you're planning to force some Dutch bulbs, you can pot them up now in potting soil, moisten it down, put those pots in a refrigerator crisper. That's just about the ideal temperature. Or you can bury those outside in soil, make sure they're squirrel proof, and then as soon as you see roots in the bottom of the pot, coming out of the hole in the bottom of the pot, it's time to bring them indoors and let them grow and give you some indoor color. Now the bulbs I have out here are arranged in order of bloom time, and when you're buying bulbs it's a good idea to plant a variety so you have some color from February on through April. Starting off here, crocus are usually the earliest. Those are the ones you see popping up through your lawn. And a fun game to do with children is to have what's called a crocus roll. And you take some crocus bulbs and just have them roll them out on the grass, and wherever they land, that's where you plant them. And that's one way of naturalizing them, so they'll come up looking as though they just came up from nature and Mother Nature planted them. Now with crocus, the planting depth, and this goes for bulbs in general, planting depth should be twice the diameter of the bulb. This crocus bulb is about 1 inch in diameter, so we'd plant it 2 inches deep. The opposite of that would be hyacinth. They're about 2 inches in diameter, so they'd go 4, maybe even 5 inches deep, depending on where you live. Now, crocus will come up year after year, give you plenty of color, and if you want them in a formal garden center, make sure that you plant them in a group of maybe 5 or maybe a dozen, so you have a nice clump. If you're planting them randomly around the yard, the first year they won't look like much, but then they'll eventually produce multiple bulbs in place and give you some brighter color. With hyacinths, hyacinths are one bulb that the first year they look beautiful. They'll have a nice big spike, a nice big bloom, very fragrant. The next year they'll look more like what we call a species hyacinth. They'll be smaller and they're still attractive, but they'll never be as big as that first year, but you can still enjoy them. They're also an excellent bulb for forcing. And with hyacinth, I also like to group those together in a cluster rather than lining a sidewalk with them. They'll look much more attractive that way. Hyacinth come in a wide range of colors from whites on through purples. And I think you'll enjoy planting some of those. Now, narcissus. Narcissus and daffodil is a term that's used interchangeably. Some people also call them jonquils. And technically or botanically, they're all in the narcissus group, but the English and we Americans usually refer to them all as daffodils. And it's just a matter of name choice, really. I have 2 kinds here. This one, the small one, is called mini narcissus. And the bulbs in this class usually are multi-flowered. They'll have many, many very small daffodil-looking blossoms. The larger ones, this is a Salome variety of daffodil. Some people refer to these as trumpet daffodils. They'll have a single large flower for each bulb. So that gives you a tip on getting your best value when you're buying them. When I go shopping for daffodil bulbs, I try to get ones that have 4 noses or 4 bulbs. That means I'm going to get 4 blooms out of this one versus only 2 blooms out of this bulb right here. So the bigger ones will really be a better value for you. Now daffodils are one of the best values in Dutch bulbs because they will multiply very freely in the garden, and you'll find after about 3 years that you'll need to dig them up and actually divide them and spread them around some more because they multiply so well. Tulips give you a wide array of colors from white to yellow all the way up to what's called the black tulip. The only problem with tulips is that they don't always come back year after year as floriferously as their very first year. They're sort of like hyacinths in that respect. But there is a wide range of colors available. They bloom a little later than daffodils, not quite as fragrant and not quite as ideal for cutting, but they are very pretty. Last of all, I have the muscari, or the grape hyacinth, and they are quite a bit smaller. Their spike will get from 4 inches to about 6 inches tall, depending on the variety that you grow. And the grape hyacinth are nice to mix in with ground covers. If you have a ground cover of English ivy or Vinca minor, you might want to put the muscari in with that. And the reason for that is that once they finish blooming, and usually they'll bloom in late April or early May, once that purple spike has gone by, you'll have some foliage left that's dying back, and it's very unattractive. And so it'd be nice to mix that in with some other ground covers. Now with all the bulbs in general, you do need to let the foliage die back completely come spring, and we'll remind you of that again next spring. You don't want to mow over it, and that might be one tip back on the crocus. If you are planting them in your lawn, try to hold off from mowing if you can. That's easy to do if you have a Bermuda lawn because it's dormant when crocus are in bloom, so there's no problem there. Bulbs in general like to be in full sun. They will do all right in semi-shade, but be aware that shaded soils will stay cool longer, and so bulbs planted in the shade will come up later and may not have as big of blooms as ones that are out in full sun. Well, I've got a little bit of planting to do back here. I want to give you some ideas on how to get good tulip growth. If you're going to plant just a few bulbs or clusters of bulbs here and there, a good way to do it is to dig out one big hole before putting them in. This way you'll make sure that they're all planted at the same depth and arranged like you want them. Now I'm going to be planting some tulips, and my hole is about 12 inches by 12 inches, and I want the bottom of it to be fairly level. Next step is to measure. I want the tulips between 5 and 7 inches deep, and that works out just right. It's right at about 6 inches. Now tulips and the larger bulbs in general need to be about 4 inches apart, and if you're planting them in groups, since for each tulip bulb you're just going to get one flower, it's nice to have an odd number in the arrangement. Those look like they're going to work out just right. The one thing I want to do before I actually put them in is to put some fertilizer in. Now I have some time-release fertilizer here, and goes by many names. You can get this at most garden centers. The nice thing about it is that the fertilizer is released slowly into the soil as it is needed. And with bulbs, you're planting them now, and they're not going to stay dormant. You'll need to moisten them, keep them moist. They're going to sprout roots right away and be growing and developing on into the winter time. So make sure that you do water them, but also make sure that they're in a well-drained place. I'll be covering these back over, and my soil is a mix of regular soil and organic matter. We've used compost and then gone over the top with wood chips. And one thing that may occur in Oklahoma, and something that makes growing bulbs a little bit difficult, is we have some warm spells in January and February, and sometimes this makes bulbs come up prematurely. You might want to have some mulch on hand if that happens. If our temperatures start to warm up, put some extra mulch over where the bulbs have been planted so that you'll be able to keep them dormant a little bit longer and have a better bloom and a more even bloom once they do come up to bloom later in the wintertime. An easy way to plant bulbs is to use a bulb planter like this one, and usually they'll have the depth marked on the side so you can gauge it that way. Now this one's from Europe, and so it's marked in centimeters. This marks 10 centimeters, but that's the equivalent of about 4 inches. So you can still use it if all you work with is the English system. Again, it helps to have a good loose soil. This soil right here has a little more clay in it than I'd like, but we're going to take the chance on these hyacinth bulbs. And when we talk about the depth to plant bulbs, again, about twice the diameter is the right depth, but also you can check it with a ruler, and the planting depth refers to the bottom of the bulb. You want the bottom of that to rest at 4 or 5 inches. I'm going to excavate this just a little bit more. Put a little bit of fertilizer in. Now on fertilizers, some of you might be strong believers in using bone meal with your bulbs, and that's great because it's a good source of phosphorus, and that's usually what root crops need most. I'll finish these up in a little while. The next thing I'll be putting in, though, are grape hyacinths behind this silver mist monkey grass right here. I think they'll blend in nicely. Their foliage and also their color will look good. And back around this tree I'm going to put in some tall daffodils. And keep in mind again, if you're planting in semi-shade, the bulbs will come up later than if they're on a south-facing slope. One last tip is that if you're concerned about rodents excavating your bulbs, and this would include squirrels, moles, gophers, what have you, you can put some protection in. Now, a couple years ago in our formal bulb bed up near the building, we dug it out and lined that with hardware cloth, and that has kept the critters from digging the bulbs from underneath and hasn't kept the squirrels out from up above, but you could do that if you laid some chicken wire over the top just for the winter, cover it with mulch if you want for cosmetic purposes. Then as soon as you see the bulbs coming up, remove the chicken wire so the leaves will have room to come up through. But that's one thing you might keep in mind. Now, bulbs take a little advanced planning and effort right now, but they'll sure pay off this winter when they welcome spring into your garden with some great color.